Last video I talked about neoliberal economics and the effect it had on society and on the recent US election. Today I want to talk about another issue I think had a bigger influence on that election, and it's one that the media also isn't talking about much. The reason they're not talking about it is because it's the media themselves. Now, the flaws in the current media have been accumulating for some time. The amalgamation of media under the banner of increasingly large corporations has been a huge problem. In the US, 6 companies own 90% of the media. That's including print media, TV, film, and radio. Here in New Zealand, 2 companies, Fairfax and APN, own about 90% of our newspapers, and our radio and TV is also owned by relatively few companies. This leads not only to an homogenization of ideas, but a greater seeking of profit and market testing. We've seen a decrease in investigating and presenting the facts and an increased focus on sales, ratings, or hits. In this regard, Donald Trump was a goldmine, a steadily outrageous flow of incompetent buffoonery and bigotry that was simply irresistible to the media. He was a freak show, a screaming toddler, a car wreck that you couldn't look away from. Some estimates work out that the US media gave Donald Trump about $5 billion worth of free advertising over the course of his campaign. And then we get to clickbait and shallow headlines. Increasingly in journalism, the demand for rapid content has turned reporters into stenographers, simply repeating press releases and government talking points. Think how quickly locker room talk became shoehorned into public discourse after Donald Trump was caught bragging about sexual assault. They were simply repeating what they were told. Lazy headlines can be massively misleading. For example, a 2015 newspaper headline read, "Deficit short-lived." Now, the substance of the article was that then Minister of Finance, Bill English, had seen what he expected to be surpluses turned yet again into deficits. But he was claiming that soon we'd be back into surplus. In other words, things had gotten worse, but he was claiming that they would soon get better again. And the headline said things have gotten better. The headline was the opposite of the article, but for those skimming news, simply reading that headline, that's all they would have seen. But this kind of laziness and greed for hits is not the only problem with the current media. I think there's a more insidious influence infecting things. For some time, the media has been moving to a position of neutrality. That is to finding the midpoint between any two issues. Now, while on the surface this might seem fair, it's often prone to abuse. Some points have objective facts, but when you factor in false neutrality, opinions have to be given equal weight to those facts. A scientist can talk about vaccines or climate change, but then they have to get someone else in to balance out those facts with their opinions. And this has led to an environment in which Trump and his surrogates can go on camera and flat out lie and still somehow retain their credibility because his lies are given equal airtime with the truth. This leads me to what the blogger Driftglass refers to as Bothsiderism. The media narrative that both sides of the political discourse are equally bad and extreme. What this has led to in America, in conjunction with elements like gerrymandering, is an increasingly skewed political system where all parties are dragged further and further to the right. Positions considered centre-right under Nixon or Reagan are now derided as being far left. And because the media keep insisting that the centre point is the midway point, large portions of the population believe it. Meanwhile, propaganda organisations like Fox News drag things even further to the right and accuse the rest of the media as being liberal. Now, whether this system is driven by a desire for consumers, by a corporate pro-right ideology, or just by a devotion to the narrative, it's of huge advantage to those willing to abuse that system. Because both sides must be equally bad, certain facts must be ignored and forgotten. So, Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell can go on television and say that Democrats need to grow up and accept Trump's nominations. not being challenged on the fact that he held up Obama's recent Supreme Court nomination for almost a year, not to mention hundreds of other government positions that the Senate held up. It's the Republicans who have gridlocked Congress, but the media isn't allowed to say this because both sides must be equally bad. The disasters of the Bush administration had to go down the memory hole as soon as Obama was elected because both sides had to be just as bad. Which brings us once again to Trump. In many ways, he and his campaign hacked the media. Not in the electronic sense, but in the sense of the code to how they operate. Remember, both sides must be just as bad. So for every revolting, idiotic, irrational thing Trump did, Clinton's flaws had to be made to look just as bad. Now, Clinton certainly had flaws and issues, but they received disproportionate amounts of coverage. With each outrageous step Donald Trump took away from the center of the seesaw, the media had to pile more weight on Clinton's side. And as there were fewer issues than on Trump's litany of loathsomeness, those that existed had to be expanded more and more, to the point where the email server issue looked like a huge mountain of a story, which probably, with a little application of certain weight, tipped the election. Trump had hacked the media. The more flawed he became, the more they had to inflate Clinton's flaws. In their effort to make both sides just as bad, they made one side seem massively worse, and a man who the majority of his own voters didn't want as president got elected. And while these issues don't seem as strong in New Zealand, they certainly do exist. The attitude that all parties, all politicians are crooked, it's not worth voting, does not rise from a vacuum. In April 2016, a story broke regarding links between a $100,000 donation to the National Party and the government then giving a grant to a chain of hotels in Niue. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the story, but I want to look at it under the lens of Bothsiderism, because remember, both sides must be just as bad, but only one side in this case got a $100,000 donation, so that was hard to make that case. But in 24 hours, the story had changed. The media had found their out. You see, one of the hotel trustees was the father of a Labour MP, Jacinda Ardern. See, balance had been restored. Both sides were equally bad. Now, only now in the US is the media finally realizing what they have done. Probably far too late. They have largely unwittingly aided in the installation of a man with the temperament and intellectual nuance of a preschooler. Whether they can pull themselves out of their freak show addiction and their both-sider impulses remains to be seen. I really hope they can do it before it's too late. Here in New Zealand, we have both this dangerous example and a challenge of doing better. Now, my words aren't going to change the way our media operates, their adherence to their narratives, their clickbait, their Bothsiderism, but I hope there are some ways we can look at the media and change the way we consume it. So, look past headlines, read the articles, read alternative sources. Don't just assume the first thing you see is true. Avoid sites that have clickbait titles and tell others to avoid them. And be alert for Bothsiderism. Trust me, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And don't be afraid to call it out, because both sides are not the same. Both sides in this country have not been in government since 2008. Both sides are not responsible for the policies of the last 8 years that have harmed this country. One side is. Take care and be heard.